Thorgal, the role-playing game, is an RPG published by the Polish publisher Dark Rabbit, and it's based on the extremely successful Belgian comic of the same name, which started in 1977 and spans decades of storytelling centered around human-like visitors from another planet who came to Earth and became ancient Vikings. The setting, as you might imagine, is a mix between classical Viking lore and splashes of science fiction. In this video, I'm going to cover the 53 or so page quick start for the Thorgal RPG, which at the time of this recording is crowdfunding on GameFound. The link for that is below. When I read through the quick start, I was struck by the similarities of the rules to D&D 5e, which then led me to ponder how different and focused the setting is in this game compared to first-party 5e settings. I ultimately concluded that Thorgal the RPG is really an ideal alternative to vanilla 5e because of that tighter setting focus and more interesting rule set. But you can be the judge of that yourself after we walk through this quick start. And again, if you're keen on backing this one, the link to the GameFound page is in the video description below. I think the most important thing to cover before jumping into the quick start here is the source material that this game is based on. Thorgal started as a graphic novel series written by Jean Van Ham of Belgium and illustrated by Gregor Rusinski. There are new volumes of the story being published to this day, and fortunately, it has largely been translated to English by Cinebook. As the story goes, strangers from another planet came to Earth. They happened to look exactly like humans, but had various superpowers like telekinesis and mind control. They established a civilization called Atlantis, but all their cities sank into the sea over time. They decided to find a new planet to live on, but they overexploited that planet and had to load a spaceship full of their society's children and send them back to Earth for a chance at a better life. This spaceship experienced a mutiny, and a newborn child named Thorgal was able to get jettisoned in an escape capsule. This capsule was discovered by the chief of a Viking tribe in Scandinavia, or the Northlands, and so begins the tale of Thorgal, who is raised as a Viking warrior. The comic is a lot more fantasy than it is sci-fi. The characters regularly interact with the Norse pantheon of gods, as well as all kinds of mythical creatures. But above all, the story is extremely entertaining and addictive to read, and there are a lot of volumes to get caught up on if you haven't yet. And that's pretty much the setting. You play as one of these descendants from the stars, possessing one kind of extraordinary power or another, but appearing as Nordic Viking folk and existing completely integrated in Viking society with little or no knowledge of your interstellar origins. The quick start actually doesn't outright specify how much your character knows or doesn't know about their ancestry, so that might be something that you'd want to hash out with everyone at the table when creating characters. The quick start actually doesn't have any character creation rules, but does come with 5 pre-generated PCs, one for each of the Viking society archetypes. This game's rules infrastructure is really pretty traditional in a lot of ways, and at least as presented in the quick start, appears to be a bit simpler than average. You have 6 core stats which range from 1 to 10, as well as some stats derived from the core stats like your vitality, focus, and athleticism, and a predefined list of skills that are built upon one of the core stats. The way the dice work is that for any given check, you roll 2d20. One d20 is your destiny die, which you can think of as your primary die, and the other is your luck die, which you may or may not use. The goal is to meet or beat a difficulty level or target number, which ranges from 10 to 40. To do so, you add the result of your destiny die as well as any applicable stat and skill rating that you have. So in a way, you can think of the d20 as a constant bonus that you get to add on to your base stat and skill score against any target number. As for that luck die, you can use that die's result instead of your destiny die, but you spend a God's Grace meta point in order to do so. These points are replenished at the beginning of each game session, so you're encouraged to use them up in each session. There's actually another meta currency in this game meant to sway your dice results. You can use your composure score to shift a die result by that value. For example, if you roll a 3 and you have a composure score of 5, you can shift that die result up to 8, but then your composure score is reduced to 4. Just like your God's Grace points, your composure point pool is replenished at the beginning of each session. Then there are rerolls, which come with certain abilities. And finally, doubles. Anytime your destiny die and luck die come up as a match when rolled, you double the value of the checked skill in your final result. Anytime you roll a 1 on the destiny die, that's an automatic failure, and a 20 is an automatic success. If an enemy ability or environmental factor is working against you, you could be jinxed, which means you can't use the luck die, shifts, or rerolls on that given roll. There's some more discussion here of the setting, and it really comes down to 3 main elements. You have the Viking culture existing with all the trappings that include small villages, farming, craftsmen, and warriors who go on raids. Their government is based on jarls and things and all things, which are like council meetings. Then you have the gods, Odin, Freya, Loki, and Thor and all that, who actually exist in this world. A game with just these 2 elements alone would make a pretty fun RPG, but you also have the third element of people in this world being descendants from the so-called people of the stars, or Atlanteans, who possess all kinds of naturally occurring powers like talking to animals, levitating, and the other examples that I've mentioned. Here are the 5 archetypes on offer in the Quick Start, all of them pretty firmly rooted in Viking culture. The Lagman is a law speaker, a highly respected sort of arbiter of laws and rules in any given village. All of these archetypes, by the way, are inspired by characters from the graphic novel series, so it can be pretty rewarding to jump into this game if you have an inspiration in mind from the comics. In the case of each of these character types, you get a couple edges and a couple special abilities called Atlantean powers. It was at this point that I realized that the game's play experience is probably fairly similar to D&D 5e. For example, with the edge here called support, once per round as a reaction, you can grant an ally within medium range a +5 bonus to any check. Then with the Visions of Bygone Days power, you can get a +2 bonus on any check except for hits in combat. All of these edges and powers really have that 5e feel to them, which in itself isn't a bad thing. The fact is, this game's character abilities are a lot more straightforward than 5e characters, and thus this game is a lot more approachable. This is especially true if you're already familiar with 5e's turn economy, what with the free actions, reactions, and all that. Vikings here, by the way, are your standard sort of fighter class. Berserkers are another more aggressive fighter class that deals a ton of damage. Archers also have some pretty deadly abilities. I thought the Master Archer edge was almost too generous. Anytime you use a bow, jinxes don't apply to you, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. That means no environmental penalties can ever affect your bow shots. Rogues also have some pretty powerful edges, but they are only once per combat. If you're a min-maxer, the rogue's edges are probably the weakest in the Quick Start, just a heads up. I thought this paragraph right here summed up the game pretty well. Thorgal, the role-playing game, tells the story of the Atlanteans who used to live on Earth but were forced to leave it and go to the stars, only to return 12,000 years later and discover that their ancient home is now ruled by somebody else. Player characters are either survivors of a spacecraft catastrophe or their descendants. The one bit that I thought was a little discouraging was this right here. Thorgal, the role-playing game, is all about making the players feel as if they were actually taking part in adventures similar to those described in the comic books. I think it's important to note that you don't really need to read any of the comic books to play and enjoy this game. I've read a few volumes and enjoyed the comics quite a bit, and I highly recommend you check them out. But if you or your players don't have the time or inclination to read half a century of backlog of a graphic novel, you can actually take the core elements of this game and run with them however you see fit. The 3 tenets of Vikings, Norse gods and legendary creatures, and extraterrestrial origins is enough for a ton of cool adventures. In the Quick Start here, there's actually a starter adventure that involves some village children going missing, perhaps taken by an ancient witch who lives in a nearby forest. The PCs are tasked with finding and retrieving the children. I don't want to give away any spoilers here, but I will say that things get pretty crazy and fantastical, invoking all of the core elements of this game that I've now mentioned a few times. The sample adventure runs 14 pages plus another 3 pages worth of bestiary. I think it's worth mentioning that the stat block design for enemies in this game is really well done in terms of readability and just general visual appeal. After the sample adventure, there's another treatment of the rules, which I did find kind of odd. It would appear that the rules explanations are broken out into 3 sections across the 53-page Quick Start instead of just being all in one section. My hope is that the final core rulebook consolidates these rules a bit more. Anyway, like I mentioned before, turn economy in this game feels very familiar since you're rolling for initiative, then for each turn during combat you have 1 move, action, 1 combat or utility action, and up to 4 free actions. Alternatively, you can take 2 move actions and forego your combat or utility action. For melee attacks, depending on the kind of attack you're using either con or agility plus one of 3 different skills, and of course, your d20 roll. With an attack to hit roll, you're trying to meet or beat a target's defense rating. If you land a hit, you look up the dice to be rolled for the weapon you're using and just roll that up. In a lot of cases, you will then subtract the target's protection rating from your damage done, and that is the amount of vitality that they lose on that attack. Ranged attacks all use the same check, which is perception plus the ranged combat skill, plus your accuracy rating and your d20 roll. Rangers are broken down into 5 categories, which I'm very grateful for. It's just the way to go for me personally. As far as health, it's measured in points called vitality, and you go unconscious when you drop to 0 or less. If you drop below double your max vitality, your character is considered forfeit. As far as recovering vitality, I'd say this game is fairly generous. Between this and the powerful edges and Atlantean powers, the game's creators really just want your character to stay alive and lay down lots of damage on enemies. Right at the end of the quick start, you get a few more miscellaneous rules. One thing worth noting is that when you want to use one of your superpowers, you have to make a star heritage check. This involves rolling 2d20 as normal, and then adding your Verve stat rating to your star heritage skill rating. I didn't see any checks or costs for using edges, which really does mean you are working with some very powerful characters in this game. There's this sheet that comes with the quick start that I thought was really intriguing because it's not mentioned in the actual quick start book. It's called the settlement sheet and hints at some really interesting game mechanics that I can only guess at. Obviously, it will be explained in the core rulebook, but I can only surmise that your party tends to a settlement that has its own health track in the form of a stability rating, and it has its own special core stats: defense, prosperity, and fortitude. It looks like it ties a party together and potentially creates an overarching storyline for the party that transcends any shorter adventure or campaign. I can't say for sure, but I think this sheet alone suggests that the game will have a lot of interesting long-term play possibilities. So there's this small but growing group of rabble-rousers in the RPG community that's really trying to get the message out that there are more role-playing games out there than Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you're a fan of my channel, then that might sound kind of strange since I've been singing that tune for a while. But really, most people who even know what a tabletop RPG is only knows 5e. And that's due to publisher Wizards of the Coast's gargantuan marketing and influencer efforts over the past 10 years. One of the only ways we can ever convert 5e only players to new RPG horizons is to introduce them to games that aren't so different that they get intimidated. Games that are adjacent to 5e in rules and setting, but different enough to illustrate the fact that there is brilliant life outside the walled 5e garden. Thorgal is one of these games. Its mechanics should be deeply familiar to any 5e player, but just different enough to be interesting and fresh with the 2d20 rolls. And the game is also more approachable because it's simpler in execution. Also, it doesn't present a particularly challenging setting. Even though it's inspired by a Belgian graphic novel you may or may not have ever heard of, no one has to read that comic beforehand to understand the concept of Viking plus gods plus monsters plus humans from another world with supernatural powers. Those are all relatively non-exotic concepts that just happen to mesh together really well. What actually makes this game, or at least in theory, better than WotC's 5e is that the setting is cohesive and comprehensible. It's not a dizzying mishmash of kitchen sink fantasy creatures and races and classes and subclasses. It's Vikings plus. We get that. It's intuitive at this point, and that alone makes it a better game. But you be the judge. Check out the details of this project at its GameFound page, which I've linked below, and be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to keep this channel alive, please consider joining my Patreon. Thanks for watching. See ya.